Okay. So what's on your screen right now is the Melons tier list, big band tier list for defense. Okay. So we're not going to talk about the tier list itself, technically, but we are going to talk about tier lists in general, how to properly read tier lists. Okay. All right. So for those who have followed my Reddit posts and talked to me on Discord over the years, you'll know that I dislike tier lists. You've seen all sorts of videos on my YouTube channel, but not a single tier list video. All right, that's not a coincidence. I didn't just forget to make one. I am actively avoiding it. But the fact remains that tier lists are a very popular way for players to take a snapshot of the metagame from their perspective. So I do think avoiding the topic of tier lists isn't something I can do for much longer, even if I don't make them myself. This is why I've decided to conduct a lecture on how to properly read tier lists. Yes, there is a way to properly read them. A lot of why there are so many misconceptions, debates, and arguments over tier lists is that most people do not properly know how to process the information that's presented to them. After all, tier lists are not as self-explanatory as they appear to be, okay? So let's get to it. I'll divide this lecture into separate discussion points. Okay. The first discussion point is about having the correct frame of mind when reading tier lists. This is, of course, a generalization, but when you really think about it, guys, like the average reactions to tier lists seem to be divided into two broad categories. Okay, the first category is like what I like to call the blind follower. Okay, this is something new players will expectedly fall under. So they look at the tier list as like a fact. Okay, and while at first glance there's no real harm in new players using tier lists as a basis for game knowledge, a closer look would show you like differently. There are problems to it. Because, here's the major problem. The fact that not all tier lists are the same. So, for example, Melon makes a tier list, and then I make a tier list, and then Odd Legend makes a tier list, and then Zio makes a tier list, and then Cardi B makes a tier list, and so as a new player, and like all of these lists, okay, and let's say in this hypothetical scenario, all these tier lists have completely different placings. Like what then? For a new player, you're gonna be more confused than informed. Okay, so that's actually a problem. The first category is very problematic if you just view it as a fact. Okay, another problem about blindly following tier lists as a new player is the fact that you won't always be a new player. Eventually, you're gonna gain more experience, and then gradually you'll be able to formulate your own opinions about specific variants. And you're one day going to find yourself disagreeing with one or two tier list placements that you've been following, right? But if you're stuck with the mentality that tier lists are like factual statements by the person who made it, then the misconception is going to do a 180. You're going to start thinking, oh, this tier list is wrong. This content creator or whoever made this tier list has lost all credibility in my eyes, blah, 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 okay? And this leads to my second category of the average tier list reader, which is where a lot of late game and end game players fall under. And this is the type of tier list reader who, whether consciously or subconsciously, already have a tier list in their heads. And they read other people's tier lists just to compare it to their own personal lists. And then they proceed to start arguments and debates when the lists look different. Okay? So obviously, these two categories are the wrong way to go about in very different ways. But they do have one common root misconception that needs to be deprogrammed from everyone's minds. And that is the misconception that tier lists are the end point of information. In reality, it's quite the opposite. They should be a starting point for information. Okay? Think of it as a drawing or painting of the metagame from one's perspective. Okay? Take note of this metaphor. Like with drawings or paintings, you need to look at the whole picture and know what the artist is trying to tell us with their work. The same applies to tier list. Take note of the metaphor, okay? Because this will be a consistent metaphor throughout the discussion. Okay. So here we go. How do you properly read tier lists? So let's move on to discussion point number 2. The first step is to know who made the tier list. This is a very overlooked first step, but it's very, very important. Okay, let's go back to the painting analogy. Without even looking at a painting, you would already know that a painting made by Pablo Picasso and a painting made by Jake Paul are going to be worth very different amounts of money. One is going to be a priceless treasure in a museum, and the other is probably something you can find in a thrift shop. Okay? This concept applies to tier lists in a sense. Okay? As you can see, our sample tier list for today's lecture will be this big band tier list for Rift made by Melon. Okay? We need to know who Melon is, and you'll see how that's relevant later on. So, Melon, if you don't mind, I will make a brief introduction for you. So, Melon's in chat, by the way. Okay. So, Melon is a high diamond player. I believe diamond 2 on average, which is within the top 50 of the entire player base. Melon has been playing this game almost as long as I have, if not longer. Melon is also a big band specialist and knows the character inside out. Yeah, so Melon came a bit after me, but 2.5 years is still a very, very long time. Okay? So, anyway, where was I? I kind of went off tangent here. So, okay, so this establishes, so remember everything I said about Melon, okay? Diamond 2 on average, big band specialist, been playing the game for a very long time. So, this establishes many things. Number 1, the person who made this list has a high rank in Rift. Obviously relevant since this is a Rift tier list. Okay? Number 2, the person who made this list is a big band specialist. Again, it's a big band tier list. So, yeah. It matters. Obviously relevant. Number 3, this person has been playing the game for a very long time. Okay? Experience matters. So, what does this information do? What does this information do? Well, a lot of things if you actually decide to use your brain. Again, tier list is not a statement of fact. It is a metagame snapshot from that player's perspective. So now that you know who Melon is as a player, more or less, probably the reason you might disagree with some of the placings is that the perspective is too far off. You might not have played the game enough yet, or you don't have enough experience in high rank Rift battles yet, or you don't have enough experience, or you just haven't been playing long enough. Like, this matters. In other words, like when a high-ranking player comes in with what looks like a hot take, before you type your 500-word essay about why this person is wrong, you better sit your ass down first and understand this person's perspective first. Okay? So, and again, so I need to clarify. I'm not saying low-level players or lower-ranking players are not entitled to an opinion. That's definitely not what I'm saying. Okay? I'm not saying like if you're low level or if you're low rank, just sit down and shut the fuck up. That's not it. You just have to understand that being in different stages of the game or different rift ranks will affect your perception of variance. And that might be where differences of opinion arise. So you just have to be aware of those differences in perspective before you make arguments about like, hey, you're wrong, or, you know. So, okay. So let's use an imaginary example on the opposite end of the spectrum. Okay? Let's say there's a tier list made by a mid-game player, somewhere between level 50 to 60, with a rift rank ranging from, let's say, gold 4 to gold 2. Okay? And you see that this person, like, in this person's tier list, like, Bad Hair Day and Cold Stones is, like, S tier on offense, and Resident Evil is S tier on defense. Okay? So, this doesn't make the tier list invalid. This doesn't make the tier list invalid. This is just what the mid-game player's perspective is of the metagame. That's just his perspective of, like, you know, because that's where he's at. That's bound to change when he reaches the late game. But you know, that's the value you have to look at tier lists, right? They're a reflection of perspective. It's not a statement of fact. Okay, so I hope I made it discussion point clear. Know who made the list. Okay, so a tip for people. So for in the future, a tip for people who are planning to make their own tier list. I think it's important to introduce yourself properly and state your credentials. Okay, if you're gonna make a tier list, right? I do think that's important. Okay. Next discussion point, which is this is the meat of the discussion. Discussion point number 2. A tier list is not always about the letters. Okay? It's not about the letters. It's about the general message. Again, going back to the painting analogy, you don't look at the Mona Lisa and say that it's a bad painting because the curvature of her lips is off by 5 degrees. That's like not how you do it, right? In the same manner, you don't say that a tier list is bad because you don't agree with a few placings. Okay? You have to take things in broad strokes and look at the overall message. So take this list, for example. Okay? Just take a good look at this list. This is for defense, Rift defense. There are some placings. There are some placings that I would change, but I agree with this 100%. So, okay. So you might be thinking, wait, what? Mr. Streamer, you're contradicting yourself. How can you say that you want to change some of it and still agree with it 100%? Like, doesn't that mean you disagree with the list? And that kind of thinking is exactly why a lot of needless debates spawn off tier lists. It's not about the letters. It's not about the letters. It's about the general message. So you have to ask yourself, instead of just looking at the letters and the fighters attached to it, it's like, what you have to ask yourself is, what is Melon trying to tell me with this list? What's Melon trying to tell me? Like, look at this list. What's Melon trying to tell me? And what he's trying to tell me is Dream Band and Heavy Metal are the best big band defenders. And next to them, you have Jazz, Resonant, and Dick. And then followed by the rest, which I agree with 100%. So, yeah. Right? So, for the sake of discussion, I want to tell you what I do. So, this is what my tier list would look like, okay? I would move the entire C tier to B tier. I wouldn't change the placings. I would move the entire C tier to B tier. I would move the entire D tier to C tier. And I would move Epic Sax to D tier. Right? That's very easy to imagine. Like, just basically shifting all of them one step up, and then Epic Sax goes up to D. And honestly, it's just to make a distinction. It's just, the reason I'm doing that is just to make a distinction between Epic Sax and the bronzes. Epic Sax still has a respectable HP pool, and because he's a natural gold, and he has light catalyst synergy. I do think that at least deserves enough credit to distinguish him from beatbox and baseline. Right? And yeah, see, fair enough. Do you see what I mean? So Melon understands the point I'm trying to make, right? Like, the fact that Melon doesn't have a problem with it, it's like, if you've been paying attention to what I've been trying to say, like, Melon doesn't have a problem with it. Why? Because my list and Melon's list, even if they're like drastically different in positions, they have the exact same message. Like, what is my tier list trying to say? Like, and what Melon's tier list is the exact same thing. Heavy Metal and Dream Band are the best, followed by Dick, Jazz, and Resonant, followed by the rest. It's the same. It's the same tier list. I mean, basically, it's the same message. And like, it's functionality. You have to look at functionality, and this is what people need to focus on. Okay. One of the dumbest. I'm gonna tell you guys a story. Okay. One of the dumbest debates I've ever witnessed was an argument. There was like an argument in game chat long ago about whether blue screen was A tier or S tier on defense. Dumbest thing I've ever seen. It was like a back and forth. It was a back and forth of like, it was a very circular argument. They were going back and forth. This should be A, this should be S, blah, blah, blah. And there was like name calling involved. So it was funny at first. And then it was starting to put me to sleep. So I dropped the popcorn And I joined in and I asked both of them, so can I ask the both of you, is blue screen a good defender? And both of them said yes. And this is the epitome of a pointless discussion. So the thing is, both have come to the same conclusion about blue screen, and they're just arguing over a letter. Okay? This is what we want to avoid. This is why I don't make tier lists. It's not really that tier lists are bad. It's that people are bad at reading tier lists. And this is what I'm trying to correct with this lecture. Okay? So this leads me to my next point. So what can I do so that I can properly learn from tier lists? So here's some tips. Here's one tip that's just gonna make everyone's lives so much easier. Ask first. Instead of typing up a 500-page dissertation on why a variant should be in another letter instead of this letter, you should first ask why they were placed there. Listen to the explanation first, and that's when you revolve the discussion around. Don't discuss the letter. Discuss the reason behind the placings. And honestly, that's all you need. Okay? And this is why I do fighter discussions instead of tier lists. All right? I skip the letters part and I just explain what the variants do one by one, like what their value is. That's why I skip those steps. But hey, if more people read tier lists properly, I might just make my own one day. We'll see. And okay, I forgot. Before we end this lecture, some tips for people making tier lists. So again, I already gave you guys one. Introduce yourself properly. State your credentials, what your rank is, how long you've been playing. So that was one tip. Another thing is, it's the same thing, same principle as reading tier lists. Don't present your tier list as a fact. You have to be open-minded. All right? Melon, I know you're like the big band expert. There's probably no one who knows big band more than you. But even then, I do think you still have to be open-minded. Okay? And you should always clarify this from you have to clarify that it's your perspective. And if you consulted with other players, if you talk to other players, you can throw their names in. Because of course, a tier list increases in credibility if multiple reliable sources agree with it. Right? So yeah, that's another tip. If you're going to make a tier list, for example, you're a high-level player, you're a high-ranking player, you might want to discuss it with other high-ranking players, all right? Okay. So this is also, okay, so this next tip is optional for people making tier lists. This is optional, but you can also explicitly define what the tiers mean, okay? For example, S tier can be defined as defenders that you see in more than 60% of Rift bases against Diamond 2 or higher. Like you can define that as S tier, right? Something like that. There are a lot of objective metrics in this game that you can utilize to make tier lists more clear cut. But again, this is just optional. Okay, this actually should have been in the lecture, and that's the concept of counterability. I do think counterability is a slippery slope. You guys have to be very, very careful when using counterability as like a basis on whether a fighter is good or bad. Like, there are dangers to it because it's a slippery slope, right? Like, if I can, one of the takes I've seen over the years is like, Meowin Forever is bad because I can just use Rusty and she's like destroyed. That's a slippery slope. Counterability for the sake of counterability as an argument is a slippery slope that leads to the conclusion that no defenders are good as long as they can be countered. That's dangerous. That's a very dangerous slippery slope. And that conclusion is 100% wrong. Right? So you have to take counterability in context with other factors. It just can't be like, oh, I can counter, that's all folks, with Perfect Dark, and she just never gets evasion, therefore she's bad. That's terrible. That's a horrible take. So you feel personally attacked? Dude, it's not just you. This is a very common misconception. This is a very, very common misconception. This is so common. Doesn't matter if you're early game, late game, end game. It's actually more common with end game players. The concept of counterability, you have to use it very sparingly, and you have to be very, very aware of the slippery slopes involved in it. I'm even a victim of this. I'm very much a non-believer of dreadlocks, even though she is strong. Exactly. Counterability is, this is more common for late game players. You guys get very, very easily. Even me, like once upon a time, I had to be very self-aware. When I started content creation, when I started making guides on Reddit, I had to really start thinking about my own thought processes and like my biases and tendencies, and I had to like correct them. And this was one of them. And this is something I do think is very common, especially with late and end game players. It's like it's an overemphasis on counterability. Yeah, I do think until now, dreadlocks being a bad defender it's a hot take. That is a hot take. Like, there are many ways to play around dreadlocks nowadays, but she is still a good. Here's the thing: the fact that you have to play around her, and the fact that you get blown up by dreadlocks if you don't play around her, that's what makes her good. I think a lot of people, there are a lot of late game players, because they're so used to destroying dreadlocks. They look at someone like me. If I say dreadlocks is a very good defender, there are a lot of end game players who would be like, this fucking washed up moron just doesn't know how to beat dreadlocks. It's so easy. She's so bad. And a lot of endgame players, they would fall under that. Believe me, dude. Melon, you think I don't know? You think I don't know? I'm part of the Discord. I've seen those takes, man. I've seen those takes. People who talk shit about my analysis about stuff because without even asking me about the thought process. I know these takes exist. So believe me, Melon, I know. And it's unfortunate, right? It's unfortunate. I am part of the community. I'm part of the Discord. I'm very open to discussions and, but like when you enter the realm of content creation, it's just, you kind of, there's an element of alienation there, right? They just look at what I say in the videos and say, hey man, this guy said this, therefore he's stupid. It comes with the territory. I accept that. But like, at least people who are on my streams, when you guys are on my streams and when you listen to the discussions, at least you guys know firsthand like what the thought process behind it is, right? When I say dreadlocks is a really good defender, one of the best defenders in the game, that's not me saying that there's no way to beat her. She's unbeatable. She's just good, right? You can say a defender is good and also acknowledge her counterability. You can do that. You can do both. So that's more or less it. The main takeaway here is that tier lists are more than just letters and the things attached to them. And it actually takes a considerable amount of reasoning skills and critical thinking to properly process this, okay?